bourgeoisie produces, above all, art zone. Gravediggers.
Hello, it's me, Mario.
Oh my god. We have to save the princess.
Yes, we have to return monarchy to Mushroom Kingdom, away from the Bonapartist Bowser regime.
It's Aaron in Seoul.
And Almer in Toronto.
In Bowser's castle.
Yeah, I fully support Bowser, by the way, for all our listeners. Like, I play Mario with the perspective that Bowser is a Napoleon Bonaparte figure trying to overthrow a very archaic feudal monarchy.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Welcome to another episode of Das Criminal Podcast.
Yeah, we missed you, and we're back, and we're ready to entertain and inform.
We've got another unsolved today, and it's not a solved unsolved, like the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. This is like truly, I can't figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, I have very, very strong theories, but there is no conclusion to this that, like, you know, it's not like they lived happily ever after or whatever.
So let's just jump right into it.
Yeah, go ahead.
On Monday, April 26th, 1999, at approximately 11:30 a.m., BBC presenter Jill Dando approached the front door of her house in Fulham, London. As she was about to put her keys into the lock, someone grabbed her from behind. He or she forced Jill Dando to the ground, so her face was almost touching the front step. According to one of Britain's leading pathologists, the assailant then used his left hand to fire a single shot into Dando's left temple. She died instantly. Jill Dando was beloved among the British public. Her murder brought shock and confusion. Why would anyone want to kill a newsreader? But 21 years, plenty of theories, and one overturned conviction later, the case of Jill Dando's murder remains unsolved. Jill Wendy Dando was born November 9th, 1961, in Weston-super-Mare, Somerset, England. And I'm just realizing her name is Jill. It's not Jillian. It's just Jill.
Oh, okay. It's actually, I mean, it's not funny, but like, Jill and Wendy are both names I don't exactly see these days. They're very like old people names, if that makes sense.
I grew up with a Jill. And also, I won't say his name, but my little brother has a name that is traditionally a nickname for another name, but he doesn't have like the more formal name. It's just his name. So I kind of like this.
Oh, okay.
Jill's parents were named Jack Dando and Winifred Mary Jean Dando. And Winifred sadly died of leukemia in 1986, 13 years before Jill's murder. When Jill was 3 years old, doctors discovered she had a hole in her heart and a blocked pulmonary artery, which required surgery. After the operation, she had what appears to be a healthy and normal upbringing. She was educated at Broad Oak Sixth Form Center, where she was head girl, which, for our listeners who are outside of like the UK, that's basically the class president. Jill was involved in theater and volunteered at a local hospital. She went on to study journalism at the South Glamorgan Institute of Higher Education in Cardiff, Wales. She worked for 5 years as a print journalist at the Weston Mercury, where her father and brother also worked. She then began working for the BBC as a newsreader for BBC Radio Devon in 1985 and worked her way up the ladder from there. In 1988, Dando moved from regional to national television as she was promoted to work for the BBC in London.
For our younger listeners, just to clarify, newsreaders in radio are kind of like podcasts, but you can't control which episode to listen to. It's kind of like live, and they broadcast, much like podcasts, they broadcast information at specific times during the day, usually news, stories, etc., etc.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, a lot of the time they are just reading it. they are not typically the ones doing all of the investigating and things like that. They are given the script and reading the news to you.
Yeah, the people who's like talking to you are reading a script. Then most of these establishments have like journalists who go out and get the news and then write the script. But then you also have like, your talk shows or whatever where you get like pundits on to voice their opinions. But that's not the same as like the newscast, which is just reading a script.
Right. And even on television, to give a pretty well-known example, someone like Anderson Cooper, he is a journalist. Like, he does go places, he interviews people, but he doesn't write everything that he says on that show or think of it by himself. He is reading off a teleprompter and other people do the research and writing.
Oh yeah, these national institutions have like an army of people that prepare these teleprompter scripts. Like, it's not just a one-man show by any means.
Right, so that's exactly what Jill Dando is doing. She is reading the news for the people.
Yes.
Most famously, Jill Dando went on to co-host a crime appeal series called Crime Watch. She and her co-presenter Nick Ross would walk the audience through a reconstruction of a significant unsolved crime to bring the public's attention to the case and hopefully spur more leads. According to Wikipedia, quote, in over 25 years, 57 murderers, 53 rapists and sex offenders, 18 pedophiles, and others were captured as a direct result of Crime Watch appeals. End quote.
Yeah, I have very mixed feelings about shows like Crime Watch because on the one hand, I mean, it's objectively good that these shows leads to capture of various violent criminals, but I also find the voyeuristic nature of these shows quite disturbing. And also I wonder if these shows may or may not complicate some crimes by, I guess, I don't know, distracting from evidence, if that makes sense.
Oh, definitely. And I think if they really harp on a red herring, obviously everyone else is going to get stuck on that as well.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds pretty similar to shows like America's Most Wanted and Dateline to me.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I used to watch America's Most Wanted a lot because it was on TV and it was like, there, which is fascinating. But one of the more fascinating things, there's another TV show in America. I don't know if it's still on, but it used to be on, called Lawman, starring Steven Seagal. And that I find to be a perfect embodiment of American culture because Seagal basically rides around with cops and they sort of use like SWAT tactics and like military gear and other like, APCs and such to like basically barge down the doors of a local drug offender. It's really, really disturbing and really alarming, to say the least.
Citations Needed podcast has definitely done at least one episode, I think even more than one, on shows like Cops and how they actually push police to sort of escalate their tactics for the cameras, and it ends up being very dangerous for everyone involved. Like, it's a really fucked up thing.
Yeah, it should be made illegal. Like, you shouldn't be carrying TV shows that like, go around with cops to like barge down people's houses or whatever.
Yeah, Jill Dando wasn't really doing that. She was just sort of standing in front of a screen and talking to the viewer about, the crime scene, the evidence, etc.
Yeah.
And Jill was really well known and well liked among the public. She was among those with the highest profile at the BBC and somewhat of a celebrity newscaster. People knew who she was. She was also 1997's BBC Personality of the Year.
Yeah, she was what I would consider the Generation X equivalent of podcast celebrities.
You're really pumping us up here. So, on the morning of April 26th, 1999, Jill Dando made breakfast for her fiancé, Dr. Alan Farthing, at his home in Chiswick, London. And here's a fun fact. Farthing is now the Queen's gynecologist.
That is an interesting fact, and one I don't want to imagine any further.
So now that that's in your head, Jill Dando actually rarely visited her house as she was in the process of selling it, and she planned on moving in with Farthing. This means it would be challenging to target her there, as her comings and goings were sporadic. Like, she would go once in a while to maybe pick up some clothes, pay some bills, check the mail, that sort of thing. But she didn't really live there. She didn't really spend time there. Dando visited a shopping center in Hammersmith, and CCTV footage there didn't show any signs of someone following her. She returned to her home by car alone and reached the front door at approximately 11:32 a.m. The killer grabbed her from behind and forced her to the ground, shooting her in the temple. Forensics indicate the shooter used a 9mm caliber semi-automatic pistol, which had been a workshop conversion of a replica or a decommissioned gun. In other words, the weapon had been altered so that it was able to fire.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but firearm regulations in the UK are a lot more stringent than in the US. Like, not every kid down the block can get a gun down at a local Walmart, so I'm thinking the killer shooting Dando with a 9mm pistol is actually a big, red flag. And, we're going to get into the theories on why that is later on, but I do want to put a pin on that right now.
Right, and that's exactly why, sadly, you hear a lot about knife crime and actually acid attacks in places like London, because guns are not readily available, so people turn to weapons you can buy, and something like a knife, obviously you could use to cut your food, do some work on your house, and acid does have purposes for cleaning and sanitizing.
Yeah, and cars and stuff as well, like battery acid.
Exactly. The shooter used his left hand to shoot, indicating that he or she is probably left-handed, though it's not inconceivable that someone could use their non-dominant hand to fire at such a close range. Next-door neighbor Richard Hughes says he heard a surprised cry from Jill Dando, quote, like someone greeting a friend, end quote, but didn't hear the gunshot. From his window, Hughes noticed a white man around age 40, 6 feet tall, walking away from Dando's house, but didn't realize what had happened. It was actually Dando's other neighbor, Helen Doble, who noticed her body 14 minutes later. Dando was taken to Charing Cross Hospital, where she was declared dead on arrival. Despite being one of the most extensive investigations of all time, the Metropolitan Police's efforts to find the killer were mostly fruitless. It was not the first or the only mysterious assassination in London. In 1987, Palestinian cartoonist Naji El-Ali was shot in the neck by an unknown assailant and died at the same hospital, Charing Cross. These killings are, as far as anyone can tell, completely unrelated. Still, sadly, it's not as though Jill Dando was the only person ever to be assassinated in London in broad daylight. Scary stuff.
Oh yeah, I want to add a tangent to that. It's a completely unrelated, relatively unrelated tangent. But to add to that sequence, Roberto Calvi was found dead in 1982, hanging from Blackbriar Bridge in London, with stones in his pockets and about $15,000 in cash and various currencies. And the reason that's a big deal is because Calvi was the chairman of Banco Ambrosiano in Italy, a bank that had collapsed that same year amidst scandals linking it to the Vatican, Propaganda Due, the Masonic Lodge, and the Gladio operations in Italy. And it's completely tangential, but I just wanted to point that out because if one of our theories is correct, and it's just a theory, then London is certainly not the place to be for what I would call enemies of the cabal.
Well, also, wasn't London where Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned?
Yes, with polonium, I believe, yes.
Yeah, London is really not that safe.
Yeah, not a great track record of staying alive there.
Especially if you are a journalist or some sort of political dissident.
Yeah.
So, police actually focused their attention on the neighborhood weirdo, Barry George, who had a history of stalking women, particularly celebrities, and sexual assault. He also had a history of mental illness. George was arrested, tried, and convicted in 2000 based on an alleged single particle of firearm discharge residue found in his overcoat about a year after the murder. Even at the time of his conviction, observers noticed that the evidence against him was weak. Police were desperate to solve the highly publicized case, and Barry George, with a history of violence toward women and mental illnesses, was an easy scapegoat. That single particle of gunshot residue was later discredited as evidence. It could have appeared due to cross-contamination during evidence gathering.
Also, not to get too chemistry major on this podcast, but literally all testing devices, from my experience in the lab, have a range of error below which a result would be considered compromised. So a single particle of gunshot residue would really, really, really not register as a conclusive result, especially with, devices from what I imagine are the year 2000, which is when this is all happening. Any lab tech worth his salt, let alone a researcher, would note the result, but would analyze further because most devices will say something like a minimum calibration 10 milligrams or 5 milligrams, or even the modern ones that say like 0.5 micrograms. Like, unless a particle is part of a larger sample, then I would just dismiss it as noise.
And if you think about it, if this person put the gun right up to her temple and fired, meaning that the noise was muffled, the neighbor didn't even hear it, they would obviously have a backsplatter of blood onto themselves, like on their sleeve, on their coat. And if he was wearing this coat and it had gunshot residue, why didn't it have any sign of blood? But it still had gunshot residue. So it was washed well enough to get all the blood out. And for some reason, he kept this murder coat, but it wasn't washed well enough to have gunshot residue. That's just bullshit to me.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So Barry George was acquitted after a retrial in 2008. There was no forensic evidence against him, and two neighbors who almost certainly saw the killer were unable to identify George as the murderer. George also successfully sued for damages after tabloids published claims that he had in fact murdered Jill Dando.
Oh yeah, and on that point, anyone who thinks the American press are bad really needs to look at the British press. They're pretty much the mecca of horrible tabloids.
There is an article somewhere about how they have treated Meghan Markle in comparison to Kate Middleton. And I don't want to defend any rich royal person. I really don't give a shit about them. But it really can only be described as racism and xenophobia.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, on that note, it's the same with how they compared, and this is football, Raheem Sterling, a black young player from Manchester City, and Harry Kane, a white British player from Tottenham Hotspur. And Raheem Sterling buys a house for his mom, and it's young starlet splurges or whatever, making him look like he's a playboy who just spends a lot of money. And then Harry Kane buys a house, and it's superstar Harry Kane buys house for mom.
Yeah, they're so awful and just so fucking transparent. We shouldn't hate Meghan Markle because she's American or divorced or biracial. We should hate her because she is rich.
Yeah, she's the Princess Peach in our early analogy.
Actually, no, she's Daisy. Kate Middleton is Peach. Yes,
Daisy and Peach, yes. And us, and I imagine all our listeners, are just regular Goomba proles.
Speak for yourself. I am a Yoshi-type dinosaur.
All right, fair enough. I'll accept that. I'm a Goomba troll and I accept it.
So, given this not guilty verdict and the lack of physical evidence against Barry George, the case is still considered unsolved. So let's get into the theories that remain. The first of these, of course, is that Barry George did it after all, and that not guilty verdict was a mistake and it let a guilty man out of prison. Now, I understand that when a woman is murdered, you look to the local creep with a history of harassing and assaulting women. That totally makes sense to me. But other than the discredited gunshot residue evidence and him being a weirdo, there's actually no evidence that Barry George murdered Jill Dando. I think he sounds like a very strange man, but that doesn't mean he's a murderer. And if Barry George did kill Jill Dando, the Crown failed at proving their case.
Yeah, I mean, Barry George, I can understand why he'd be investigated given his history. But I also think that just having mental illness doesn't necessarily make you a murderer. And based on what we've seen from the evidence we've listed above, it's very, very, very difficult for me to believe that he did it.
Right. I totally understand as the first step looking to neighborhood sex offenders and people with a history of violence toward women. That makes sense to me. But I think police got stuck on that first step and they got tunnel vision and they didn't consider any outside explanations for her death.
Yeah, and I imagine they just wanted to get the case over with so they can avoid the publicity and all that.
Oh, for sure. So the second theory is that a deranged fan killed Dando after she rejected him. Jill's brother Nigel informed police that Jill had become upset by, quote, some guy pestering her, end quote, before her death. But the Met ruled out this lead. As a high-profile celebrity newsreader, it's definitely possible Jill Dando could have an obsessed stalker who waited at her house until she arrived and killed her.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, but I also think that going back to the gun, I imagine a crazy fan would be much more likely to use a knife or a common implement to kill Dando, considering how difficult guns are to obtain in the UK and the prevalence of knife crime, like you said, or even acid crime, really. a knife would make much more sense to me than, a crazy fan trying to source an actual gun to shoot her.
No, for sure. And I think if John Lennon was killed by a mentally disturbed fan, it's certainly possible that Jill Dando could have been, but the major difference here is that Mark David Chapman was immediately caught. And when I think about it, like Christina Grimmie and other people that immediately come to mind as celebrities killed by fans or even stalked by fans, they have been pretty much immediately caught.
Yeah, exactly. And, like a crazy fan theory makes sense, but also not, because also the other thing is that with crazy fans, there's usually like a paper trail leading up to it. If there was a crazy fan, then surely there must have been like fan mail or attempts to contact her, phone calls, messages, etc., etc. And I know her brother said that she was disturbed by this one guy, but there doesn't seem to be much of, a paper trail behind it. And usually with these crazy fans, there's always like, it's very easy to track them because they make it very easy because they're not necessarily trying to hide their fandom or whatever.
Exactly. So how would this deranged fan be crazy enough to murder a celebrity in broad daylight, but then never be caught in 21 years?
Yeah, if you do that, then I imagine he would have mentioned it to someone or something, really.
Yeah, precisely. If a person did that, they are obviously not in a sound state of mind. So how are they somehow a deranged fan, but also a criminal mastermind? It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, same, yeah.
The third theory is that a jealous ex-boyfriend or secret lover killed Jill Dando. But police ruled this out after checking phone records and speaking to Dando's friends and acquaintances, so I don't really want to spend time on it because it doesn't seem like a solid theory to me. I mean, it's possible, but there's just no supporting evidence so far.
Yeah, I agree, yeah.
The fourth theory is that Jill Dando was killed as a result of mistaken identity. But this also seems unlikely, as Dando was killed in front of her own home, and she was a well-known television personality. Like, someone would have been like, oh, that's Jill Dando. The next theory is that somebody convicted as a result of Crime Watch hired an assassin to murder Jill Dando as revenge, though police did rule out this possibility. But my question here is, what would assassinating Jill Dando bring to a convicted prisoner? She was a newsreader on Crime Watch, meaning she read a script for the audience rather than investigating crimes like a detective. Certainly, other people involved in the case, like the victims, witnesses, detectives, lawyers, judges, were more involved in the actual convictions.
Okay, I mean, I agree that I don't think it's impossible, but I don't think it is realistic. But also, to entertain the possibility, I don't know, I can think of a couple of reasons. Either A, if a prisoner was part of a larger organization, like a gang or something, maybe the other members of the gang killing Dando would, send a message to people like, don't investigate us or don't mess with us or whatever. Alternatively, it could just be like, pure vengeance, like, fuck you, you got me in prison, I'll get you killed. But again, I don't think that is necessarily realistic. I don't know, it doesn't seem like a feasible option.
Also, unless you are already in a gang or a group of people who does assassinations, hitmen are very, very expensive. And if I were in prison or my relative were in prison because of Crime Watch and Jill Dando, I would be putting all my money toward legal fees, like hiring a better attorney, making appeals. I wouldn't be wasting tens of thousands of pounds on a hitman for fucking Jill Dando.
Yeah, again, this is all hypothetical. I'm not encouraging anything, but if I were to spend money on a hitman for revenge, I'd target people who are more directly responsible for putting me in jail than a fucking TV host reading a script. And also the other thing is, if the person wanted to get back at Dando for a Crime Watch, why not go after her co-host as well, Nick Ross? Because there were two of them, right? So why go for her and not the other one? Or both?
Right, and why not threaten him or something, like, you're next?
Yeah, exactly.
So the next theory is, and it's kind of weird, so bear with us, that Bosnian Serb or Yugoslav groups assassinated Jill Dando in retaliation for the NATO bombing of the Radio Television of Serbia headquarters 3 days before. So, if you did not know, 16 employees of Radio Television of Serbia were killed and 16 were injured when a single NATO missile hit their building in Belgrade. The United States argued that the network was used to spread Serb nationalist propaganda, though France was opposed to the attack. For the record, Noam Chomsky views the bombing as an act of terrorism.
I mean, yeah, even if the claim that they spread nationalist propaganda was correct, you can't just go fucking airstriking and droning any publication you don't like because their material itself is what you would consider morally objectionable. You don't go straight from morally objectionable content to mass executing staff.
Right, exactly. And we've recently talked about this too, but not everyone in the building would even be propagandists. Like you have custodians and people like that as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Jill Dando had previously appealed for aid for Kosovar Albanian refugees during the Yugoslav wars, making her a possible target for revenge. An opposition journalist had been assassinated outside his home in Belgrade only a few days before Dando's murder, and the method for each killing was identical. But in my mind, like, what does that mean? They were shot by someone in the head?
Yeah, it's not exactly, a smoking gun here, metaphorically.
Right. So I also think, why wouldn't the assassins or their organizations have taken credit or threatened to kill another journalist if the bombings continued? Nobody in the former Yugoslavia ever took credit for murdering Jill Dando or having her murdered.
Yeah, I mean, also, I feel like it's much easier for Yugoslav nationalists to kill, or Serb nationalists to kill someone in Belgrade than it is in, West London.
Right, for sure. The organizations would have to mobilize fairly quickly to go from a bombing on the evening of the 23rd to a targeted assassination on the morning of the 26th, especially considering Jill Dando rarely visited her Fulham home.
Yeah, you at least find a journalist with a more predictable routine.
And given that the conflict was still going on, the NATO bombing campaign wasn't over yet, why wouldn't these organizations say, if you don't stop bombing, we'll kill another journalist? Like, that is the first thing I would have done if I were a terrorist.
Yeah, the whole point is to send a message to prevent further action, not to make it a secret or anything.
Right. You have to at least try to get your political point across or scare people enough that they are afraid to do whatever it is they're doing that you're mad about.
Yeah.
Now, this is where we're really getting into the conspiracy, but hear us out.
Hang on, I need to go stretch before I injure myself with this. Okay, I'm ready.
Okay.
Let's do this.
Here we go. Jill Dando was killed because she was investigating a possible pedophile ring at the BBC during the mid-1990s and compiled a dossier of her findings. Now, in 2012, a year after his death, it was revealed that BBC media personality Jimmy Savile had sexually abused hundreds of people throughout his lifetime, many of them prepubescent children sick in hospitals.
If you're not aware, Jimmy Savile was a personality with a BBC show that was, I think he had a show called Jimmy'll Fix It. And
yes,
sick kids will call in asking for basically was equivalent of a Make-A-Wish and he'll make it happen or something. But then he'll abuse these kids.
Right. All along, he was systematically abusing these children.
Yes.
According to a report by the Crown Prosecution Service, some of these offenses took place on BBC premises. Later reports showed that the higher-ups at the BBC had heard rumors about Savile's behavior as early as the 1970s, but took no action. A review by Dame Janet Smith published in 2016 found a, quote, atmosphere of fear, end quote, existed at the BBC that kept people from speaking out, quote, as they feared reprisal, end quote. 20 years following the murder, both the BBC and ITV put out documentaries on the case, but the ITV program was much more investigative than the BBC program. Is this possibly because the BBC doesn't want people seriously looking into the case?
Yeah, I mean, for our Patreons who listen to our mini-episode review of the book BBC, Myth of a Public Service, there's a long history and a documented history of deep connections between the BBC and British intelligence like MI5 and MI6, including, again, documented and undisputed proof of BBC heads meeting with intelligence officers to coordinate various programs and coverage of news items. And, considering what we know now of Prince Andrew and Jeffrey Epstein, and what we know of the Savile case, it genuinely wouldn't be surprising to me that Dando's investigations tripped a few alarms in the office and a BBC head had lunch with someone from MI5 and mentioned it, and MI5 had to deal with it.
And this is definitely the most tinfoil hat theory, but in a way, the most compelling. Because as a journalist and someone who obviously cared about crime, Jill Dando may have heard about Savills or other BBC workers' sexual abuse and planned on investigating or bringing these allegations to light. I think this is completely plausible. And by the way, it's not just Jimmy Savile who was implicated in these findings and these reports. It's like 8 other people somehow associated with him as well.
Yeah, Google Operation U3.
Right. So the reason that this is not just a theory that's, throwing things at the board and seeing what sticks is that there was a pedophile ring at the BBC.
Exactly.
If you believe that a powerful pedophile ring enabled and then got to Jeffrey Epstein in prison, it's not a far-fetched to assume they would assassinate a journalist possibly working on a case. And let's also not forget the British connection. Jeffrey Epstein was very close with the likes of Prince Andrew. These are shady people who have already done shady things.
This is without us even getting into Princess Diana, which, I think we should do an episode on entirely. But just to point out that the British family and British deep state are A, extremely powerful, B, and don't fuck around. I also wanted to mention that the word conspiracy theory has gotten a lot of flack, especially lately with the rise of things like QAnon. And I think it's a very double-edged sword because on the one hand, things like conspiracy theories can act as a sort of coping mechanism for a powerless public, as Felix from Chapo said in the latest episode. But also, if you sat someone down in like the 50s or the 40s and told them about COINTELPRO, or even if you sat someone down in like the early 2000s and told them about what's going to happen with the NSA and like the Snowden leaks, like before the Snowden leaks and the Chelsea Manning leaks, if you told someone, yes, your government is monitoring your cell phones every interaction or whatever, chances are the person will call you crazy or a kook or like a tinfoil person or whatever. And, there's some conspiracy theories that are, out there and, not to be believed, like, flat earth or whatever. But, at the end of the day, certain theories are there because there are powerful interests. These powerful interests have a vested power to keep their interest as such, to keep their power as such, and they're not above doing dirty things to maintain their status, their power, their privilege, their access to the levers of power. And things like Jeffrey Epstein, things like Jill Dando, things like Jimmy Savile, they're just symptoms of that. And as far as Jimmy Savile goes, at least for me, I find it fascinating how quickly that investigation hit dead ends, in the sense that I think Jimmy Savile is what I call a limited hangout, in that Jimmy Savile is dead, so it doesn't matter if you reveal everything about him, but you make sure that it doesn't affect people who are still living.
Oh, absolutely. And to even bring ourselves outside of conspiracy theory, let's look at what we have, right? We have Jill Dando, by all accounts, an upstanding person who everyone loved, who took an interest in crime and investigation. She was a journalist as well as a newsreader. She went to school for journalism. So you have Jill, you have her shot in the head on her doorstep. That is an undisputed fact. You have, at the same time, a covert pedophile ring at the BBC. And you have police getting tunnel vision for this man named Barry George, arresting him, trying him, and this conviction later overturned because all the evidence was basically bullshit, the forensic evidence, the gunshot residue in particular. So what are we looking at here?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you look at all of this and it's very hard to not be cynical about it.
The killing, at least in my opinion, has all the marks of a hit. The only confounding factor is that the gun was repurposed to shoot, which law enforcement says is out of character for an assassination. Hitmen want a weapon that they know will work. But isn't it possible that this was so the weapon would be more difficult to trace? And almost any type of gun is a surer bet of killing your target and only your target than a different weapon like poison or acid.
Yeah, and I mean, I imagine also that the killer, even after repurposing the gun, tried it a couple of times, practiced. And B, I imagine if the gun failed, the killer would have had no qualms using his hands to throttle her.
Right, and they didn't go up to her and, as far as anyone knows, try to have a conversation with her. They didn't try to talk to her. They were waiting for her. She went up to her door. They came up behind her, forced her to the ground, and shot her. That is it. That to me doesn't sound like a deranged fan. I think a fan wouldn't be so calculated like that, especially if they were suffering some sort of mental breakdown. And it's a hit. If you watch someone's house with a gun in your pocket, waiting for them to come home so you can shoot them, that's a hit.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Like a fan wouldn't have the level of calculation to like, or the efficiency really, just come out as soon as he sees her come out, one bullet to the head and then disappear without anyone seeing them. Like there's only one description from one neighbor and barely that. And, you know, I imagine a fan would sort of amble about or like try to break into the house and like see something or try to talk to her before doing it. You know, or like, yeah, generally speaking, this entire situation is way too calculated, way too efficient, and way too sterile, for lack of a better word, to, you know, indicate anything besides a very organized and very professional assassination.
Celebrity stalkers eventually killing their victims is unfortunately not unheard of, like Mark David Chapman, Christina Grimmie, but those people got caught immediately because they were literally suffering from a mental breakdown at the time. They didn't even try to hide what they were doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just genuinely don't know with this one. I'm leading toward some kind of cover-up, but obviously if there's a cover-up, we're not going to have all the answers because they are being covered up.
Yeah, and they're still in power. So maybe once we have our own version of the Bolshevik Revolution and the Bolsheviks reveal all the papers like they did with the Tsar's government, then we'll find out.
Oh, definitely. And this is also something where I could see in 20 years some sort of dossier dropping that shows the police knew much, much more than they did.
Oh, yeah, I definitely think this is going to be like a Fred Hampton situation.
Yeah, so that is the Jill Dando murder and our thoughts on it.
Yeah, I hope we left you with a little bit of a meal to chew on.
Yeah, we should have a Patreon bonus episode up soon. It's a long one, guys. It is taking us quite some time with some research. And then beginning next week, we have a really, really awesome series starting that we've planned for almost the whole time we've had this podcast. So that's going to be really exciting.
Yeah, I'm really hyped about that. And speaking of Patreon, shout out to new Patreon subscriber, Jojo Padilla. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but thanks for subscribing. We really appreciate all our support. And yeah, you'll see us with this new series that we're working on that I'm really hyped out about.
You can subscribe to our Patreon as well at patreon.com/dascriminal. Or if that's not really in the cards for you at the moment, please just, keep listening, review us on Apple Podcasts, share with your friends. All of that stuff is free and it really, really does help out the pod.
Yeah, it does. It really does. I really appreciate all your support. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, guys. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.